The first thing Thorn did when I walked into its pen was nothing. That sounds like a small thing. It wasn't. The previous 4 handlers had all needed surgery. One of them, a Kithran male, built like a cargo loader with arms wider than my chest, had lost the use of 2 fingers on his left hand and had been placed on permanent restricted duty. The one before him had spent 11 days in medical with 3 fractured ribs and a puncture wound in his shoulder that the station physician had described, in the incident report, as consistent with a primary limb strike at near full extension. The one before that had resigned from beast handling entirely and transferred to administration. The one before that had simply resigned. The file on Thorn ran to 63 pages, and the last line of the summary was a recommendation in bold type. Irrecoverable, recommend controlled termination. I read that file sitting in the processing dock at Farpost 9, waiting for my kit to clear inspection. I'd read it twice on the transit in from Hello Station, so I mostly just looked at the last line again and thought about what kind of animal earns that word at 4 years old. The answer, as best I could reconstruct it from the rest of the 63 pages, was one that had been treated for its entire 4-year life as a weapon that needed sharpening. Every conditioning entry, every protocol notation, every incident report told the same story from a slightly different angle. Handlers approaching with full confrontation kit, deterrence protocol provocations, conditioning rods at the ready, multiple-person entry teams operating on the assumption that the animal was a problem to be managed rather than a thing they were in a room with. The beast had responded accordingly. When everything around you approaches as a threat, you become the kind of thing that threats approach. This is not a complicated observation. It took me about 6 pages to form it. I am not a beast trainer. I want to be clear about that before anything else, because the story got retold so many times afterward that it acquired a flavor. It never had some notion that I knew something the handlers didn't, that I had a gift or a method or a philosophy I'd brought with me from somewhere. I didn't. I was a retired combat medic who'd spent 22 years patching up people who'd gotten too close to things that wanted to kill them. And when my contract with the hegemony ended, I took the first reassignment that came through, which happened to be assistant pen coordinator at a frontier prison colony 3 transit days from anything resembling civilization. It was a demotion dressed as a lateral transfer. I knew it. My supervisor knew it. The clerk who processed my reassignment papers had the decency to look at the floor when he handed them to me. I disagreed, publicly and on record, with a senior official about a medical protocol that had gotten 2 people killed, and the way institutions respond to that kind of inconvenience is to move the inconvenient person somewhere they'll cause less friction. Farpost 9 qualified. Warden Seth Oras met me at the dock personally, which I did not take as a good sign. People in his position don't meet incoming assistant coordinators personally unless they want something from the conversation that won't make it into any written record. He was a compact man, Oras, that particular kind of compact that isn't small so much as compressed, like something large that had been pressed down into a smaller shape over a long period of time. He had the eyes of someone who had spent a long time deciding things about other people, and had never once, in his own estimation, been wrong. He shook my hand the way you shake the hand of someone you've already categorized, and are simply confirming the category of. Morrow, he said, you have a medical background. 22 years, I said. Good, the last pen coordinator had an engineering background. That's probably why he only lasted 3 months. He said it like an observation, the way you note the weather, not a warning, just information about conditions. The Vel'skaar in Bay 9 has been designated irrecoverable. I need an assessment confirming that, and I need it in writing before the Oversight Board's quarterly review. That gives you 6 weeks. I looked at him. You want me to confirm a decision that's already been made? He didn't blink. I want you to assess the animal and document your findings. And your findings? There was a pause, It was the pause of a man who had gotten where he was by understanding when to stop explaining and start watching. "The board requires documentation," he said. "I require documentation. Thorn has injured 4 staff members, refused every conditioning protocol, and cannot be returned to deterrence rotation in its current state. The assessment should reflect the animal's actual condition." He let that sit. "Welcome to Farpost 9, Coordinator Morrow. Bay 9 is at the end of the C-block corridor. I recommend you don't go in alone on your first visit." I thanked him and went to find my quarters. I went in alone on my first visit. That was not bravado. I want to be clear about that too. I went in alone because I'd read the file and noticed something that the 4 previous handlers had in common. They'd all gone in with at least one other person, and every incident report described the same sequence: Thorn ignoring the primary handler, fixating on the secondary, and then events escalating from there. The multi-person entry is a standard deterrence protocol for aggressive animals because it provides backup if something goes wrong. What it also provides is a confirmation to the animal that it is in a confrontational situation, because confrontational situations are when groups of people come through the door together wearing the same gear and moving in the same pattern. Thorn had been in confrontational situations 4 times with 4 separate teams, and had responded accordingly each time. That wasn't a failure of conditioning. That was an animal that had learned to read the room accurately. It wasn't a theory exactly, more of a question I wanted an answer to. The pen in Bay 9 was large by frontier station standards, maybe 12 meters on a side, with a rubberized floor and ceiling vents that kept the temperature at the lower range Vel'skaar prefer. There was a viewing window set into the near wall, which I ignored. Thorn was in the far corner when I came in, and it did not move. I had seen Vel'skaar before, in passing, at other postings. They are not easy animals to look at without your hindbrain making certain observations. 6 limbs, the front 2 functioning as either hands or forelegs depending on what the animal wants to do with them. A carapace of overlapping chitin plates, crystalline at the edges, that catch the light in a way that makes it hard to judge exactly where the animal's surface ends and the air begins. A quality, that is, I later learned from Orvek, actually a sensory adaptation rather than camouflage, something to do with how they process spatial information in low-light conditions. Thorn was large for its age. The file put it at roughly the same mass as a terrestrial lion, but longer, lower slung, with a tail that ended in a barbed ridge it could deploy as a third weapon if the first 2 weren't handling the situation adequately. Its eyes were compound, amber gold, and when it looked at you there was a quality to the attention that made you feel like something being measured for a specific purpose. I walked to the center of the pen. I sat down on the floor. I did not have food. I did not have a conditioning rod. I did not have any of the equipment itemized in the handling protocols, all of which I had deliberately left in the corridor outside the pen door. I had the knowledge, from 22 years of sitting with badly injured people in very small spaces, that the most important thing you can do when something is in pain and afraid is to make yourself small, quiet, and utterly unthreatening, and then wait long enough for the other thing to decide you're not a problem. The hardest part of that process is always the waiting, because the human nervous system is not well designed for sitting in a room with something dangerous and choosing not to act on that information. I had done it enough times that the impulse had worn down to something manageable. Thorn watched me from its corner. I did not look directly at it. I looked at the wall to the left of it. Vel'skaar have compound eyes, direct sustained eye contact reads, as best anyone has been able to determine, as a challenge display. Looking adjacent is not a signal at all. It's the visual equivalent of being furniture. I sat there for 40 minutes. Thorn did not move. I did not move. Twice, something moved in the corridor outside, footsteps. Probably someone curious enough to walk past but not curious enough to stop. And Thorn's head tracked the sound with a rotation that was precise and unhurried, and then came back to its former position. It was watching me in the peripheral way of the compound eye, registering without fixing, the way you keep track of something you haven't decided about yet. At the end of 40 minutes I stood up, said good enough for today, to no one in particular and left. I wrote in my initial assessment log, Day 1, Animal Alert Defensive Stationary, no incident, no approach, recommend continued observation. Auras read it the same day. I know because he appeared at my office doorway that evening looking like a man who had been given a meal he hadn't ordered and was now trying to determine whether it was the wrong meal or whether he was in the wrong restaurant. No incident, he said. Correct. It didn't approach you. Also correct. He looked at me for a moment. The assessment requires more than no incident, Morrow. I know, I said. I've been here one day. He left without responding. I ate my dinner and went to bed early. On day 2 I went back in. Same approach. Sat down, center of the pen, looked at the left wall. This time I brought a ration bar, the compressed kind that come in foil packs, and I opened it slowly and ate it while I sat there. Not offering it, not making any gesture toward the animal. Just eating, the way you eat when you're not thinking about it, methodically, because it's fuel, not because it's enjoyable. Thorn was in the same corner. It watched me eat. On day 3 it moved. Not toward me. It moved to a position roughly 4 meters to my right, curled its 6 limbs in a particular way I hadn't seen it do in any of the documentation footage. A compaction of the body, joints tucked, tail flat, and stayed there. I continued eating my ration bar. It watched me eat. I wrote in my log, Day 3. Animal relocated within pen without provocation. Posture non-aggressive, no incident. Day 5, it was 3 meters away when I sat down. Not because I had done anything differently. I used the same entry, the same position, the same unhurried sitting down, but because it had already moved before I got there. I noticed this and wrote it down and didn't say anything about it to anyone. Day 8, it was close enough that I could hear it breathe. Vel'skaar have a respiratory sound that is nothing like breathing as mammals do it. It's more like a very slow, very controlled pressurization, a quiet cycling of air through structures that don't work the way our lungs do, and that produce a sound somewhere between a bellows and a tide. Sitting there listening to it, I thought about the file. 4 years old. Irrecoverable. The word that gets applied to something when the people in charge of it have run out of patience and want the paperwork to say it was the thing's fault. I did not touch it on day 8. I ate my ration bar, I sat, I listened to it breathe. When I left, I checked my own pulse, and it was completely normal, which was either a sign of equanimity or a sign that something had been recalibrated in me by 22 years of field medicine, and I could no longer correctly assess what ought to make me nervous. On day 9, I set a piece of the ration bar on the floor between us and did not look at it. I was halfway through my own piece when I heard the quiet click of chitin on rubberized flooring, and then the piece was gone. I kept eating. Thorn cycled its breathing. The lights in Bay 9 hummed at a frequency that had probably been annoying to every handler who'd ever worked there, and that I had already mostly stopped noticing. I wrote Day 9. Animal accepted food from proximity. Approach was voluntary, unhurried, non-aggressive. No incident. Recommend extension of observation period. Auras appeared in my doorway again that evening. Extension, he said. He said it the way you say a word when you are testing whether it is going to dissolve if you hold it up to the light. The assessment isn't complete, I said. You have 5 weeks left. Then I have 5 weeks to complete a thorough assessment. He looked at me for longer this time. The eyes of a man who had categorized me on day 1 and was now encountering data that didn't fit the category. The board meets in 6 weeks, Morrow. What I need from you. I know what you need from me, I said. I'll have a complete and accurate assessment ready before the board meets. He left. I wrote up my notes and went to bed. On day 12, Pran. The younger handler from Bay 8 stopped me in the common room doorway and told me that Auras had asked him to keep a separate log of my sessions and submit it directly to the warden's office. He said this with the expression of a man who had been asked to do something that sat uneasily and had decided, after sitting with the unease for a day, that the right thing to do was tell me. I thanked him and told him to keep the log as asked and to write down exactly what he saw, which was what he'd have done anyway. Later that day, I went to Orvik's office and told him. He considered it in his Jeth way. He is documenting his own documentation, he said. Yes, that is a man who expects to need the paper trail. That's what I think too, I said. Then what you write in your log matters as much as what you observe in the pen, he said, possibly more. It was good advice. I had already been writing carefully. I became more careful. Every entry was precise, grounded in observable fact, attributed accurately, and free of the kind of hedging language that reads to a review board as uncertainty rather than rigor. I was not building a case. I was documenting a reality. Those are different things, but the difference is a fine one, and the people reading your documentation are sometimes not equipped to see it without help. I want to be honest about something. I did not, at that point, have a plan. I did not have a theory about Thorn that I was testing in a systematic way. I had a set of observations that didn't match the file's conclusions, and I had the professional habit, ingrained over 22 years, of updating my understanding based on what was in front of me rather than what I'd been told to expect. The difference between a good medic and a bad one is almost entirely that. The bad ones treat the chart, the good ones treat the patient. The chart said irrecoverable. The patient had eaten a piece of my ration bar without taking the hand along with it. Those two things didn't add up, and until they did, I was going to keep sitting on the floor. The staff at Farpost 9, I should say, had opinions. There were 11 of them in the Beast unit, Vel'skaar handlers, conditioning technicians, one veterinary specialist named Orvik who was a Jeth, a species I'd not worked with before, who stood roughly to my chest and had the careful, dry manner of someone who had been the smartest person in every room they'd ever entered and had long since made a practical accommodation with that fact. The others were a mix. 2 younger handlers, Pran and Sel, who had been at Farpost 9 for less than a year each and had never worked with a Vel'skaar at Thorn's classification level. 3 senior handlers, the most experienced of whom was a woman named Ress who had 6 years with the species, and the quiet, squared-off manner of someone who has survived long enough in a dangerous job to have stopped performing competence and started just being it. And a handful of technicians whose names I learned slowly, because they worked in the outer bays, and our paths crossed only at shift change. All of them heard about Day 9 within 24 hours. The Beast unit is a small community, and the viewing window in Bay 9 has a corridor alongside it, and I would have been naive to think my sessions were unobserved. I didn't mind. I minded the interpretation that came with the observation, which was mostly some version of, the new coordinator has gotten lucky twice and will eventually learn better. Ress was the first one to say something to me directly that was not that. It didn't come forward, she said. We were standing in the unit common room and she said it without preamble, the way people say things they've been holding for a day and have finally decided are worth saying. When it took the food, it stopped just inside your space and took it and moved back. I watched the footage. I noticed, I said. The last handler who got close enough for voluntary food contact. I read the file, I said. She was quiet for a moment. Then, the Vel'skaar that I work with, Bay 10, Merc, 7 years old, he does that. Stops at the edge of the space rather than coming fully in. He started doing it after about a year with me. I always thought it was something he'd worked out on his own about how to operate around a human without triggering the defensive response protocol. She paused. I think Thorn may be doing the same thing faster. I looked at her. Why faster? She thought about it. Merc had a year of inconsistent handling before I took him. Thorns had 4 years of provocation-based protocol with 4 different handler teams. I wonder if that many bad experiences makes an animal better at identifying when something different is happening, not worse. I didn't say anything. I turned that over. Or it kills them, she said matter-of-factly, which is more commonly what happens, but Thorn didn't die. She went back to her work. I stood in the common room for a while, thinking about what she'd said. Then I went and updated my log. Orvek pulled me aside at the end of the second week. "I've reviewed your logs," he said. I assumed someone would. Thorn has not initiated contact with a handler in 14 months. The last time it did, the handler needed 11 days in medical. "I read the file," I said. "The warden has shown me your logs as well. He believes you are falsifying them." I looked at Orvek. He had very still eyes, the Jeth not cold exactly, just economical like everything about him. They didn't move unless they needed to. "What do you believe?" I said. He considered for a moment. The Jeth have a way of considering things that is visibly different from how humans do it, a very slight stilling of the face that you can learn to read as active processing once you know it's there. "I believe the file on Thorn was written by people who approached it as a malfunctioning piece of equipment," he said. "I have believed that for some time. I was not in a position to act on that belief." He paused. "I have been at Farpost 9 for 3 years. I have made 14 written recommendations regarding Vel'skaar handling methodology. 12 of them have not been acted upon. And the other 2 were acted upon in ways that technically incorporated my language while operationally ignoring my intent," he said. There was no bitterness in how he said it, just accuracy. "I am telling you this because I think you should be careful, and because I will support your assessment if it is accurate, regardless of what that support costs me professionally." "That's a significant offer," I said. "Yes," he said. "Thorn is a 4-year-old animal. The offer is proportionate to what is at stake for it." He walked away. I stood in the corridor for a moment. Then I went to write up my day 14 notes, which were detailed enough that the document was beginning to look less like a log and more like a brief. The codification happened around day 18, and I include it here in some detail because it became, subsequently, a significant data point in ways I could not have anticipated at the time. I had fallen into the habit of eating my ration bar in Thorn's pen in a specific way, sitting cross-legged, bar unwrapped on my knee, eating slowly, one piece at a time. This was not a deliberate choice. It was the way I ate when I was being still and not thinking about how I was eating, which is the way I'd eaten ration bars for 22 years in field conditions, where rushing through a meal meant someone might need something while your mouth was full and your hands were occupied. Cross-legged on the ground, unhurried, methodical, that was the posture. On day 18, Thorn sat down in front of me, not curled in the corner, not positioned to my side, directly in front of me at a distance of maybe 60 centimeters. It arranged its 6 limbs in a configuration I had not seen it use before. I want to be precise here, because Orvek later asked me to describe this in writing. It tucked its 4 rear limbs beneath its body, placed its 2 front limbs on the floor before it, and lowered its abdomen so that it was, as nearly as a 6-limbed insectoid predator can approximate the posture, cross-legged. The weight distributed forward, the body low and settled, the tail flat. Nothing about it was a threat display. Nothing about it was a submissive display either. It was the posture of something that had decided to be comfortable. Then it waited while I unwrapped the ration bar. I set a piece in front of it. It ate the piece without looking away from me. I kept my face neutral. This took some effort. Not because I was afraid. Fear had receded from these sessions around day 12, replaced by something more like professional absorption. But because what was happening was striking enough that the part of my brain that forms observations was trying to say several things at once, and I didn't want any of them to show on my face and alter the dynamic. We sat there, cross-legged together, or the Vel'skaar approximation of it, and 8 ration bars in the humming quiet of Bay 9, and I thought, 63 pages. Irrecoverable. 4 years old, and it had watched me do this same thing 17 times and decided it was worth doing. I wrote in my log, Day 18. Animal has adopted parallel feeding posture that closely mirrors handler's seated eating position. Posture appears deliberate, held consistently through the full duration of the session. No prior documentation of this behavior in Thorne's file or in standard Vel'skaar behavioral literature that I have been able to locate. Recommend Orvec review. No incident. Recommend continued observation, extended timeline. I did not tell Oras about this directly. He read the log. He appeared in my doorway the next morning. He did not say anything immediately. He stood in the doorway and looked at me with an expression I had not seen on his face before, not anger, exactly, and not contempt, exactly. Something more like a man reviewing a structure he'd built and finding a load-bearing wall in a place he hadn't put one. Something load-bearing that he hadn't authorized and couldn't immediately account for. It was cross-legged, he said. As close as the anatomy allows, yes. You're telling me a Vel'skaar with 63 pages of incident documentation sat cross-legged in front of you and ate a ration bar. That is what I am telling you, I said. There was a pause that had a different quality than his previous pauses. His previous pauses had been tactical. This one was something else. You're either the best handler this station has ever seen or you're writing fiction in your logs, he said. You're welcome to observe, I said, any time. He took me up on that the following day. He stood behind the viewing glass with 2 of his senior staff and Orvec, and Thorne and I had our ration bar in the standard configuration, cross-legged, 60 centimeters apart, unhurried. Thorne glanced at the glass once, maybe 4 minutes into the session, a sweep of those amber-gold compound eyes that lasted less than a second, and then looked back at me and continued eating. The glance was not a threat display. It was not alarm. It was the glance of an animal that was aware of additional observers and had decided they were not relevant to what it was currently doing. None of the 4 people behind the glass spoke for approximately 90 seconds after I came out. Ress, who had been one of the 2 senior staff, said to me quietly in the corridor, "I've been doing this for 6 years." I waited. In 6 years, I've had one animal that I would say genuinely chose me. Merc in Bay 10, 7 years old, veteran of 2 other postings. She paused. It took Merc 8 months. She walked away. I stood in the corridor for a moment, and then Oras came out and said, "That changes nothing. The animal is still classified irrecoverable." Orvec, standing slightly behind him, met my eyes. He said nothing, but his expression, for just a moment, did something that was not quite a smile and was more than neutrality. "The board review is in 3 weeks, Oras continued. "My position remains the same. I will need your written assessment." He paused. "I want to be clear that a reclassification recommendation from you will be reviewed against the full incident record, and the full incident record is 63 pages of documented aggression. 1 month of anomalous behavior does not outweigh 4 years of conditioning failure." I said, "I'll write what I've observed." "What you've observed isn't representative," he said. There was an edge in it now that the previous conversations hadn't had, not anger, but the tone of a man who has made a decision and is now encountering resistance he'd calculated as unnecessary. "What you've observed is an animal that has learned to get food by performing calm around one specific individual. That is not recovery. That is a more sophisticated form of manipulation." I thought about that. I thought about day 3, when Thorne had moved to a position 4 meters to my right without any cue from me. Without food in the pen, without anything on offer at all. I thought about day 18 and the cross-legged posture, and the way it had held it for the entire session, consistently, not as a learned response to a reward, but as something it had worked out on its own, and decided was worth doing. "I'll write what I've observed," I said again. He was quiet for a moment. The compression in him had a different quality now, Less the weight of authority and more something that wanted to be anger but was too controlled to quite get there. The review board will want a live demonstration. I'm going to make sure they get one. That sentence had a shape to it that I didn't like. I noted it and moved on because there was work to do. The next 2 weeks were the most careful work I've ever done, and I have done careful work in field hospitals with 2 broken instruments and a patient bleeding from 3 places at once. I documented everything. Every session, every behavioral note, every postural change, every instance of voluntary contact and the exact parameters of it. I measured proximity with the room's environmental sensors, logged contact duration, recorded every variation in Thorne's breathing pattern that I had learned to associate with specific states. The slow cycle that meant settled and present, the faster, shallower cycle that meant alert without threat, the particular pressurization shift that seemed to accompany what I was increasingly willing to call contentment. I cross-referenced all of it against every piece of Vel'skaar behavioral literature I could access through the station's research terminal, which was not a great deal, but was enough to establish that nothing in the standard literature predicted what I was observing. I recorded Orvek's parallel observations and attached them to my own. Orvek had begun visiting Bay 9 independently, standing at the viewing window for sometimes 20 or 30 minutes at a time, and his notes were the product of 3 years of veterinary observation filtered through a mind that approached biological data the way a very precise instrument approaches measurement, without preference for any particular outcome, and with absolute fidelity to what was actually there. His notes were invaluable. I told him so, and he said, "The animal is interesting," which from Orvek was the equivalent of a standing ovation. By the time I was finished, I had a file that was 91 pages long and concluded, clearly and without qualification, with 2 words in bold: recommend reclassification. There was something that happened around day 23 that I included in the file, and that I want to describe here in more detail than the formal documentation allowed. I put my hand on Thorne's carapace. Not on the dorsal plates. Those are sensitive in ways that are not well documented, but that Orvek had flagged in the margin of one file page with a small notation that read simply, "Avoid pressure-sensitive, unclear mechanism. No good data." I put my hand on the lateral flank, where the plates overlap in a looser arrangement, where the material under your hand has a texture like warm slate, slightly porous, with a very faint vibration beneath it that I'd first noticed on day 21, when Thorne had been sitting close enough that my arm rested briefly against its side. I didn't plan it. I put my hand there and didn't move it. Thorne went entirely still. Not the stillness of something about to strike. That stillness I had learned to recognize from the footage, a specific tensing of the rear limbs, a slight lift in the tail, a shift in the head position toward the target. This was different. This was the stillness of something that had stopped all the small ambient movements that living bodies make, as though it had chosen, deliberately, not to do anything that might make my hand move. I held my hand there, didn't press, didn't stroke, just rested it. After maybe 10 seconds, the breathing cycle changed, a longer, slower pressurization than I'd heard before, deeper and more sustained, and Thorne turned its head approximately 15 degrees toward my hand and stayed there, not looking at my hand, just orienting toward it, the way you turn toward warmth. I sat with my hand on its side for a long time that day. When I finally stood to go, Thorne stood as well and walked with me to the pen door, which it had never done before. I wrote that entry 3 times. The first draft read like a field note and missed the thing it was trying to say. The second draft was too long, tried too hard. The third one I kept because it said what I needed to say in professional language and let the data carry the weight. Day 23. Physical contact established, handler initiated, lateral flank. Animal response. Quiescent, sustained, non-aversive. Possible positive state indicator in respiratory pattern change. Subject followed handler to pen exit following session conclusion. First occurrence. Recommend reclassification assessment at earliest opportunity. The night before the board review, I sat in Bay 9 for an hour after my standard session ended, not eating, not doing anything in particular, just sitting. Thorn was folded against my right side, a posture it had started adopting around day 26, settling its full weight against my arm and shoulder with the particular completeness of an animal that has decided a space is safe enough to rest in. And its warmth was radiating through the lateral plates into my arm and shoulder the way a hearthstone holds heat after the fire's gone down. I am not, as I've said, a sentimental man by disposition. 22 years of field medicine manages most of that out of you, and whatever was left had been finished off by the preceding 2 years of institutional friction. But I thought about the last line of the original file, and I thought about what it means when a system decides something is irrecoverable, and I thought about how often that word is applied not to the thing itself, but to the patience of the people around it. I said quietly to no one in particular, "You're not nothing, Thorn." The breathing cycle slowed. The board review was held in the station's secure observation theater, a room that looks like a smaller version of a surgical amphitheater, tiered seating in a curved arc, glass partitioning, the pen floor visible below through reinforced viewing panels. There were 7 board members. 3 of them were hegemony oversight officials I had not met before. One was a Tauren named Drevk, gray-scaled and elderly in the way that Tauren go elderly, which is to say without any visible diminishment. If anything, the elderly Tauren have a quality of compacted attention that the younger ones don't, as though the years have simply removed everything extraneous and left only the parts that matter. The other 4 board members were station administrators I knew by face. Auras sat at the floor level, at a table positioned so that he faced both the glass and the board. I stood to his left. Orvek was in the back row of the tiered seating with a datapad, positioned with the deliberate stillness of a man who is present as a witness and has decided to be nothing else unless he decides otherwise. Ress was also in the back row. She had not been assigned to the review. She had asked to attend as a secondary observer, and whatever she'd said to get that approved, she hadn't told me about. Pran and Sel, the 2 younger handlers, were standing in the corridor outside, also not assigned. I saw them through the doorway glass when I came in. Sel gave me a small nod that I returned. Thorn was brought into the pen below us by 2 handlers I didn't know, brought in from another station. I understood later, because Auras had decided that having any of the regular Farpost 9 staff in that pen was a variable he didn't want. They were both in full protective kit, and they moved with the brisk, tightly controlled manner of handlers who have been briefed that the animal is dangerous and are taking that briefing seriously. They brought Thorn in on a guideline, which it allowed. When they released the line and left the pen, Thorn walked to the center of the floor and stood there. It looked up at the glass. The amber gold sweep of its compound eyes moved across the observation theater slowly, registering the shapes behind the reinforced panels, the arrangement of the room, the positions of the people in it. I watched this and kept my hands on the rail in front of me and my expression even. Then it found me and went still. Auras stood. He addressed the board in the tone of a man who has given this speech before and expects it to land the same way it always has, the fluency of someone who has repeated an argument so many times that they've stopped noticing the points where it doesn't quite hold. He outlined Thorn's history, the incident documentation, the 4 handler injuries and their severity, the failed conditioning protocols, the irrecoverable classification. He described the documentation as representing a clear pattern of irreversible aggression. He said that what they were about to observe would confirm that classification, and that the appropriate response was the one already recommended in the original assessment, controlled termination, to be carried out within 30 days of the board's ruling. Administrator Drevk said, "We have also received an assessment recommending reclassification. Coordinator Morrow." Auras turned to me. His face was controlled in the way faces are controlled when the person wearing them has decided not to show the thing they're actually feeling, and is running that decision through a great deal of processing power. I said, Thorn meets every criterion for safe handler interaction under the Vel'skaar revised protocols established 18 months ago. I've documented daily observation across 34 sessions, totaling over 90 hours of pen time. The incident data in the original file is consistent with escalating handler approach methodology rather than with baseline animal disposition. On the basis of that documentation, my recommendation is reclassification to recoverable, with assignment to trained specialist care and a managed reintegration protocol. There was a pause in the room. Auras said, with respect to Coordinator Morrow's assessment, the board should observe the animal under standard deterrence protocol conditions before accepting a reclassification recommendation based on a single handler's anomalous experience. Drevk said, proceed. What Auras had arranged, and I had suspected something like this from the shape of his sentence 2 weeks earlier, was a standard aggression provocation test. This is a protocol used to assess whether an animal retains its deterrence conditioning. A handler in full coverage threat display kit enters the pen, the kit mimicking the visual and olfactory profile of a confrontational predator. The animal is expected to respond with a threat display, and if sufficiently conditioned, controlled aggression. It is a test designed to confirm, in documented form, that an animal is dangerous in a way that is useful to the people administering it. The handler who entered the pen, a large Kithran male I had not seen before, brought in from another posting, whose kit had been calibrated to maximum provocation setting, was carrying a shock rod and moving with the controlled aggression display gait that the provocation protocol specifies. He stood in the pen doorway for 3 seconds. Then he took 1 step forward. Thorn turned to look at him. Thorn turned to look at him the way you look at something you have correctly identified and are not concerned about. The compound eyes tracked the Kithran male for perhaps 2 seconds. Then they moved. The handler took another step and raised the shock rod to horizontal position, the secondary challenge display in the deterrence protocol documentation. Thorn's head turned, very slowly toward the glass. Toward me. I have tried to describe the silence in the observation theater at that moment to people who weren't there, and I've never quite managed it. It wasn't the silence of shock, though people were clearly not prepared for what they were seeing. It wasn't the silence of suspense, though the room was certainly waiting for something to happen. It was the silence of a room that had just received information it didn't know how to organize yet. That moment before the categories you use to understand a thing rearrange themselves around what the thing actually is. Thorn looked at me through the glass. I kept my hands on the rail, my face even. I said nothing, because the truth was I didn't know with certainty what was going to happen next, and I had the profound conviction, grounded in 22 years of sitting with things that were deciding what to do next, that the worst thing I could do was pretend that I did. Auras standing to my right said, Provocation Level 2. The handler reached to his kit and triggered the secondary olfactory emitter, the territorial intrusion chemistry that in standard deterrence training reliably produces a charge response. The pen changed, very slightly, in some quality that I couldn't sense directly but that I could see Thorn register. A subtle shift in the set of its limbs, a brief lifting of the sensory arrays at the anterior end of its carapace. Thorn looked at the handler. Then it looked at me. Then it walked slowly, with that fluid, low-to-the-ground movement of the Vel'skaar when they are not in a hurry, when they have decided where they are going and are not especially interested in how they look getting there, to the pen wall nearest to me. It stopped with its carapace approximately 15 centimeters from the glass. It sat down. It arranged its 6 limbs in the configuration I had first seen on day 18, tucked, folded, the front 2 placed on the floor before it, and it looked up at me through the glass and cycled its breathing. The long, slow pressurization that I had first heard on day 8, and that I now knew as well as my own heartbeat. Nobody in the observation theater said anything for a long time. The handler with the shock rod was standing in the center of the pen looking at the back of Thorn's carapace with an expression I could see even from where I stood, the expression of a man who had walked through a door expecting a room and found sky. He looked at the pen door. He looked back at Thorn. He looked at the observation glass. He lowered the shock rod slowly. Aura's turned to me. His face was doing the thing it does when a structure has been found to be missing a wall it was designed around. He opened his mouth. Drevk said, "Thank you, Warden Auras, that will be sufficient." There was something in the way the administrator said sufficient, a quality of weight in the word, a finality, the word as punctuation rather than continuation, that made it take up more space in the room than such a small word usually does. Auras closed his mouth. The handler left the pen. Thorn tracked his exit without turning around. Vel'skaar can independently orient their sensory arrays without moving their heads, a fact I had put in my assessment on page 47 with a reference to Orvek's prior publication on the subject. And when the door sealed, it turned back to the glass and remained where it was. Administrator Drevk from the upper tier said, "Coordinator Morrow, I've read your assessment in full. The methodology is sound. The documentation is thorough." A pause. "The board will take a recess before deliberating, but I think you should know that 63 pages and 91 pages are two very different numbers, and the difference matters more than the larger figure." Orvek from the back row closed his datapad. He looked at Thorn for a long moment. The particular still quality of his gaze that I had learned over weeks was not neutrality but a form of deep attention. And then he looked at me and nodded once, not a gesture of congratulation, more like the acknowledgement of something that had been true for a while and had now simply become visible to enough people to matter. Res beside him said nothing, but I noticed, when I looked back at the gallery, that she had her arms crossed and her chin up in the posture of someone who has been right about something for a long time and has just watched the room catch up. The deliberation took 47 minutes. I spent it in a corridor 2 levels down, eating a ration bar. I had brought it in my jacket pocket out of habit. The outcome was a full reclassification. The wording in the official record was circumspect in the way official records are when they are describing the professional failure of someone who is still technically employed. The original irrecoverable classification was found to have been based on methodology documentation that did not adequately account for handler approach variables, and the recommended termination order was rescinded. The Farpost 9 Beast unit was placed under a 30-day administrative review. The station's deterrence protocol methodology was flagged for independent assessment. Auras remained as warden. Institutional inertia is harder to redirect than a single classification, and I had enough experience with institutions to know which battles to pick. He and I never had another doorway conversation, which I consider a reasonable substitute for the conversation I would have preferred to have. What I got was a permanent penkeeper appointment, a reclassification of my own from assistant coordinator to specialist handler, a title I had not held before and did not particularly need, but which carried with it a budget line and a set of new quarters in C block that had an anteroom large enough for a Vel'skaar to sleep in. Thorn chose to sleep there. I want to tell you about the other thing that happened, because it became, as I said at the start, regarding the codification, a significant data point that I think belongs in the full account. During the 3 weeks between day 18 and the board review, Farpost 9 had 2 other Vel'skaar in the adjacent bays. Bay 8 held a younger animal, about 2 years old, still in early conditioning, a smaller, less physically imposing animal than Thorn, but with the same compound amber eyes and the same quality of measuring attention. Bay 10 held the older one, Merk, Res's 7-year-old with the quiet disposition she had described to me in the common room. I had minimal interaction with either of them. They were not my assignment, and both Ress and Pran, who handled Bay 8, were competent people who did not need me wandering into their protocols. But the pens shared a ventilation system, and Vel'skaar's sensory capabilities include acoustic and olfactory ranges that Orvek had documented as significantly exceeding human equivalents. What Ress and Pran reported, beginning around day 21, was that both animals had started doing something new at feeding time. Bay 8, the young one Pran's charge, not yet named in the documentation, referred to by Pran informally as the kid, had begun arranging itself in the folded limb posture before Pran arrived for the morning session. It was sitting in the posture, waiting, when Pran came through the door. Pran had found this sufficiently unusual to flag it to Orvek, who had visited the session and documented what he observed. Bay 10, Merk had begun it 2 days later. Ress had come in on her morning session to find Merk already in the posture she recognized from the footage of Thorn's sessions, sitting with a patience that she described to me as the patience of something that has been doing this for longer than it has actually been doing it. Ress described this to me in the corridor outside C Block, with an expression that was caught between professional bafflement and something that was trying not to be something else, and was losing. "The cross-legged thing," she said. "Same as yours. The ventilation connects all 3 bays. Orvek thinks the young one started copying Thorn's posture and sound pattern during feeding sessions, and the behavior propagated. He published an initial note on it. He's writing the full paper now." I thought about that for a moment. "They can't actually cross their legs," I said, "anatomically." "No," said Ress. "They've each worked out the version their own configuration allows. The young one does it differently from Thorn. Merk does it differently again, but they all do it." I thought about 3 animals in 3 adjacent bays, each working out their own anatomical approximation of the same posture. None of them trained to do it. None of them rewarded for it. All of them arriving at their own version of the same thing through observation, and whatever process it is that one animal uses to look at what another animal is doing, and decide that the doing of it means something. "Has Orvek given it a formal name?" I said. She glanced at her datapad. "In the paper he's calling it Observed Parallel Feeding Posture Adoption in Proximate Vel'skaar Following Handler Contact Normalization." "That's very Orvek," I said. "The handlers aren't calling it that," she said. I found out what the handlers were calling it 2 days later, when I saw it written on the scheduling board outside the Beast Unit office in Ress's block handwriting. Not the formal documentation name, just the shorthand that had attached itself naturally to the morning session entries for bays 8, 9, and 10, because a thing that gets scheduled needs a name that can be written in the time it takes to write a scheduling entry. Quiet Hands Protocol. 3 words, written in the plain block print of someone who named a thing because a thing without a name is harder to schedule around, and because the name itself, once you saw it, was obviously right. The hands weren't quiet because they were trained to be. They were quiet because something had decided quiet was worth choosing. I stood there in the corridor looking at it for a moment. Then I went to eat my ration bar, and Thorn came and sat across from me, and we were both, as nearly as either of us could manage, cross-legged. That was 3 years ago. I am writing this in the anteroom of my C-block quarters, at a small desk I had installed because the original room configuration didn't include one, which I consider a reasonable accommodation for someone who does a great deal of documentation. It is quiet at this hour, the station's overnight cycle, lights at minimum, the ventilation doing its low background work. Thorn is asleep on the floor behind me, 6 limbs arranged with the precision that I have long since stopped finding unsettling, and now find simply accurate. Each limb placed exactly where the animal's geometry of rest requires it, the tail flat, the carapace plates in the loose arrangement they settle into when the body beneath them has decided it is completely safe. The breathing cycles at perhaps 1/3 of the waking rate, Slow, deep, even. Farpost 9 now has 9 Vel'skaar in residence. 6 of them do the quiet hands posture at feeding time. Orvek's paper was published in the Hegemony's Xenobiology Journal 4 months ago and has received a moderate amount of attention in the specialist community and a somewhat more substantial amount of skepticism, mostly from institutions whose beast-handling methodology would need to change if the paper's conclusions were taken seriously. These things move slowly. I know that. I am a patient man. What I would say, if someone asked me to summarize what I learned in Bay 9, what the 63 pages missed, is this. The file recorded what Thorn did when it was treated as a weapon that needed to be aimed. It didn't record what Thorn would do if someone came in, sat down, and waited without anything to prove and nothing to demonstrate. Those are not the same animal. They were never the same animal. We called one of them irrecoverable, and the other one has been asleep 3 feet behind me for 3 years. It will be awake soon. Thorn knows the shift change by the pressure differential in the ventilation even before I'm fully conscious of it myself, a fact that I documented on day 61, and that still strikes me, 3 years later, as one of the more useful data points in the whole 91 pages. It will come to my chair when it wakes and place one of its front limbs briefly on my shoulder, a gesture it started around month 2, and that has not varied in its quality since, though Thorn is now appreciably larger than it was then, and then it will go to the pen door and wait, not with the restless, managed waiting of a conditioned animal that has been trained to a location. With the patient, settled waiting of something that has nowhere to be except where it has decided to be, and has decided to be here. I have been in a lot of rooms in my life with things that wanted to kill me. I have treated people who came back from those rooms in worse shape than they went in. I know the difference between an animal that tolerates you and an animal that has decided you're worth something. Thorn decided that sometime around day 3, when it moved 4 meters to the right for no reason I'd given it, with no food in the pen and no signal on offer, and sat. I caught up to that decision a few weeks later. The board records are sealed. Oraz's personnel file is not my business and not my interest. The 91 pages are archived in the Hegemony system, where documentation goes to be correctly filed and very occasionally, when the right person needs it, found. The scheduling board outside the Beast Unit office still has Quiet Hands protocol written on it. Res has reprinted it twice when the board was replaced, because someone asked her to preserve it, and she did it without ceremony, in the same block handwriting, because she is the kind of person who maintains a thing when it becomes load-bearing and doesn't require an explanation for why. Every morning, in the amber gold quiet of Bay 9, 6 limbs tuck under a warm slate carapace, and a breathing cycle slows to the pace of something with nothing to prove and nowhere to be, and we eat our ration bars together. I don't know exactly what Thorn gets out of it. I know what I get. I got 63 pages replaced with 91. I got the word irrecoverable struck from a file and replaced with something that fits better. I got 3 years of mornings in the quiet, with something that had been declared a weapon learning what it felt like to be called something else. The ventilation shift is in 11 minutes. Thorn knows this. So do I.